The night was quiet, just the soft rustling of leaves in the cold breeze. In a small town where everyone knew each other, Margaret sat alone on her porch, sipping her evening tea. The old wooden house had seen better days, but it was home. At 78, she had lived a life of service, once standing strong in the military, protecting her country. Now, her battles were different. Loneliness, memories, and a body that didn't move as swiftly as it once did. But one thing remained unchanged: her love for the flag that waved proudly in front of her house. That flag had history. It wasn't just any piece of cloth. It had been with her through it all. She had carried it through deployments, folded it with care, and hung it up every morning with pride. It was more than just fabric. It was a reminder of the sacrifices she and so many others had made. But that night, trouble lurked in the shadows. A group of young men, faces hidden under dark hoodies, moved toward her house. They weren't from the neighborhood. Margaret had never seen them before. Whispering, laughing under their breath, they pointed at the flag. One of them pulled out a lighter, and within seconds, flames flickered against the cool night air. The red, white, and blue began to burn. Inside, Margaret heard something. The crackling of fire, the low murmurs of voices. Her heart pounded as she stood, setting her cup down with a slight tremble. She stepped toward the door, peeking out the window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Her flag, the one she had protected for decades, was turning to ash. Her hands tightened into fists, but instead of panic, a steely determination settled over her. She wasn't just some helpless old woman. No, she had seen worse, fought tougher battles, and tonight, these outlaws had no idea who they were messing with. Without hesitation, Margaret reached for her phone. Her fingers dialed a number she hadn't called in years. As the line rang, she took a deep breath, her voice steady when someone on the other end finally answered. "It's me," she said, her tone firm. "I need you to do something for me. Right now." What happened next would leave the entire town in shock. The voice on the other end of the phone was quiet for a moment. Then came a low, serious reply. "Margaret? Is everything okay?" Margaret's eyes stayed locked on the flames outside. The young men were still there, watching, some laughing. She could see the flicker of light reflecting in their eyes, but they had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. "No," she said firmly. "It's not okay. I need a favor." There was another pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Tell me what you need." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Get the old team together. I don't care what it takes. I need them here. Tonight." The man on the other end, someone from her past, someone who understood, didn't ask for details. He just said, "Consider it done." Margaret hung up, her grip tight around the phone. Outside, the fire had died down, but the damage was done. The flagpole was blackened, the flag reduced to nothing but ash on the ground. The group started to walk away, their voices growing faint as they disappeared down the street. She didn't chase after them. She didn't yell. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch, her boots firm against the old wooden planks. The wind had picked up, carrying the last wisps of smoke into the night sky. Margaret bent down, running her fingers through the ashes, feeling the loss settle in her chest. She had fought too hard for this country, had seen too many of her friends never make it home, to let this go. As she straightened, her sharp eyes followed the direction the group had gone. She didn't need to know their names. Not yet. She would. For now, she had a different plan. She turned back inside, locking the door behind her. Her house was small but filled with history. Photos lined the walls. Her younger self in uniform, her old unit standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling, despite the weight of the world they carried. There were medals, folded flags, and reminders of the life she once lived. A life that, until tonight, felt like it belonged in the past. But the past had a way of creeping back in. Margaret walked to a cabinet in the corner, one she hadn't opened in years. The key still hung around her neck, resting against her chest, like it always had. She pulled it off, hands steady, and slid it into the lock. The cabinet door creaked open, revealing a box wrapped in an old military jacket. She pulled it out, placed it on the table, and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. Old letters, a rusted dog tag, a small leather book filled with names, numbers, connections to people she had once trusted with her life. And, at the very bottom, a folded piece of cloth. It wasn't just any flag. It was her unit's flag, one that had flown in places most people couldn't even pronounce. It had seen things no flag should see. Margaret unfolded it carefully, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. The stars and stripes were faded, but they were still there. Strong, resilient, just like her. She draped the flag over the back of her chair and sat down, staring at it for a long moment. The night was far from over, and she knew the real battle hadn't even begun. Somewhere out there, those boys thought they had gotten away with something, that it was just a flag, just a prank. They had no idea. Margaret leaned back, exhaling slowly. She knew the team would come. They had always come when it mattered. And when they did, she'd make sure those responsible learned a lesson they'd never forget. But not with anger, not with violence, with something far more powerful. A lesson in respect, in consequences, and in the fact that some things, no matter how much time passes, still matter. She glanced at the clock. It was only a matter of time now. Outside, the wind carried the last bits of smoke away, but the real storm was just beginning. The town had always been quiet at night, but tonight felt different. The wind carried something heavier than just the chill of the season. It carried a shift, a feeling that something was about to happen, and Margaret wasn't the only one who sensed it. Miles away, in a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, a group of men sat together in a corner booth. They were older, faces lined with experience, voices low and measured. They had lived lives most people couldn't imagine, had fought in places the world had forgotten. And when the call came, they didn't hesitate. One of them, a man with salt and pepper hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, leaned forward. Margaret wouldn't call if it wasn't serious. The others nodded. That was the unspoken rule. Time had scattered them across different paths, but the bond they shared was stronger than time itself. If one of them needed help, the other showed up. No questions, no hesitation. Back in town, Margaret was preparing in her own way. She didn't have weapons or brute force, but she had something far more dangerous: her mind. Years in the military had sharpened her instincts. She had been a strategist, a problem solver, and tonight, she was putting those skills back to work. She sat at her small kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. In front of her was an old notebook, pages filled with careful writing from years ago. Some of the names in it had been lost to time, but the ones she needed were still there. As she flipped through the pages, she thought about those boys, those young men who had stood outside her home, laughing as they burned something she had spent her life defending. They didn't understand. They had no idea what that flag meant. But they would. Somewhere across town, those same young men were celebrating. They had no idea their actions had set something in motion. To them, it had just been a joke, a way to stir up trouble. They didn't know who Margaret was. One of them, a tall boy with a restless energy, tossed his lighter onto the table in front of him. "Did you see her face?" He laughed. "She didn't even come outside." Another smirked. "Probably too scared." "What's she gonna do? Call the cops?" The leader of the group, a boy named Travis, leaned back against the wall. He wasn't laughing as much as the others. There was something unsettling about the way the old woman had looked at them before. They left. She hadn't yelled, hadn't chased after them. She had just watched. Something about that felt off. Yeah, he muttered. Maybe we should lay low for a bit. The others groaned, but Travis wasn't so sure this was over. And he was right. As the night stretched on, the pieces were moving, the team was gathering, the town was shifting, and somewhere in the darkness, Margaret sat in quiet determination. This wasn't just about a flag. It was about respect, about teaching a lesson that went beyond words. And by the time the sun rose, those boys would realize they had made a mistake bigger than they ever could have imagined. The night stretched on, but Margaret didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the empty street, waiting. She knew they would come. They always did. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second bringing her closer to what she had set in motion. She had spent years believing her days of battle were behind her, that her fight was over. But tonight, she felt something stir deep inside her, something she thought she had buried long ago. Then, just past midnight, the sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. Headlights swept across her yard as a black SUV rolled to a slow stop outside her house. The doors opened, and figures stepped out, moving with the quiet precision of men who had spent their lives in places where silence meant survival. Margaret pushed herself up from her chair and opened the door before they could knock. "Come in," she said, her voice steady. The men entered, their presence filling the small room. They were older now, but there was no mistaking who they were. These were men who had fought beside her, men who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and still stood strong. The man with the scar, Harrison, was the first to speak. "Tell us everything." Margaret didn't waste time. She told them about the boys, about the flag, about the fire. She didn't let anger creep into her voice, but the weight of what had happened was clear. This wasn't just vandalism. It was something deeper. Something that spoke of a generation forgetting what sacrifice looked like. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Harrison exhaled slowly. "You want us to find them?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I already know who they are. I want to teach them something they'll never forget." The men exchanged looks. They had been expecting a call for help, maybe even revenge, but this was different. Harrison nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" Margaret turned toward the table, where the old military flag still lay, draped over the chair. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her mind already working. Meanwhile, across town, Travis was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The others had laughed it off, said it was nothing. But deep down, he knew they had made a mistake. He grabbed his phone and checked the time. Late. Too late to do anything about it now. Still, sleep wouldn't come. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. As the town slept, a storm was building. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who knew that some lessons had to be learned the hard way.